It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. Hi, it's Feedback Friday, and I have recovered from my very frustrating Nier Automata session on Twitch yesterday. There was something going on with that game. I think it probably had to do with the windowing, but I was getting like weird. I noticed later that even my OBS was acting up, so it's possible that installing that FAR mod made the whole thing a little jank, and maybe a few restarts will help it. I don't know. We'll see on Tuesday. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about your feedback for the week. And fortunately, a bunch of stuff tied into the thing I promised I was going to talk about this week, which was, not how not to alienate white dudes. Cis, straight white dudes, I should say. I want to do a few things first. Actually, first, I should do the Patreon before I forget. Help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. This shouldn't get demonetized, but it might. But if you like this sort of content, it's hard to sort of keyword game SEO. I mean, things like the Last of Us 2 video are great for traffic, shitty for quality interaction. For people who did not see the tweet I put up yesterday, I disabled comments on the Last of Us 2 video because too many people were posting spoilers in the comments section. And not the kind that you have to clear spoiler alert in the comment and you have to click down to expand the comment to see it. It was just right there. They were dropping spoilers in the comments, and I was going through and originally deleting them on Wednesday, but I could not keep up with them. So I just disabled comments because if people want to read spoilers, fine. If they don't want to read them, I would feel utterly terrible if I just left it there and somebody accidentally got spoiled in my comment section. So just full disclosure, that's why I did it. I'm going to jump around a lot here. I admit I was really, really surprised at how little pushback I got for my views on The Last of Us 2. I've had a bunch of people linking me to alternate theories of The Last of Us 2. And one person, I'll keep it short, but one person linked me to a theory that it was actually a pay dispute linked to COVID-19. Apparently, and I can't confirm any of this, I'm just sharing it because, shut up phone, because it is plausible. These sorts of pay structures do exist, in part because of the way games are funded and the fact that until they ship the game, until it is released, the publisher holds back money from the developer, who has to hold back money from their staff. So there was apparently, and again, I cannot confirm this, there was apparently an agreement, according to an internet rumor, from an alleged Naughty Dog insider who's unidentified. So obviously, grain of salt, grain of salt, grain of salt. But there was a stipulation in the contract that they got a bonus 6 months after the game shipped. Of course, the game was delayed, and a lot of people were in some financial trouble because of COVID-19. And so they went to the higher ups and asked, can we get our bonus now? And apparently they didn't want to give a few people the bonus now because everybody would want their bonus now. Apparently somebody from the higher levels got their bonus ahead, or at least the rumor went around that they did. And so this one employee released the stuff to force the game to release sooner, and so people could get their pay as a form of COVID-19 relief. I'm not sure about the theory of spoiling to release a game sooner, because my understanding was the problem was the manufacturing of the actual discs for PlayStation, not the development of the game. So I'm not sure how leaking footage would have forced them to release the game earlier. But the rest of that, I talked about just because somebody asked me, is this a type of agreement that happens in gaming? It not just happens in gaming sometimes. Contracts are all over the place. Like you got to understand, in entertainment, people get what they can get. And if you want to work on a game, you have to agree to the terms of the contract. So you're kind of at the mercy of the higher ups being decent people. And that's not just true of games, that's true of any entertainment. Completion bonuses are there just so people don't and it would make sense in something like a first party game where they do have the luxury of delays and increased funding that other studios don't, that they put in incentives like that to complete the game sooner. I don't know that it's fair to push that onto employees, but there you have it. That's kind of what I think about that. It's an interesting theory. I cannot verify it. Another person said, another article I was linked to about the reason for the leaks was that employees were upset at the cancel culture within Naughty Dog, that people had issues with the Christian religious cult element of the game, but they didn't feel like they could speak up. I'm not entirely sure about that one, simply because the first game had a religious cult in it, and it was a white guy leading it, like I said before. It is possible that there is a certain amount of cancel culture. Don't speak up, you get fired. A lot of people are afraid of getting fired at a lot of studios post Gamergate. I'd need more information on that one to find out whether that is an exceptional circumstance at Naughty Dog or not. Though they certainly do seem to be trying to set expectations that the game isn't fun in a traditional sense. And I don't know why you'd make a game that wasn't fun. That seems like something that's not the smartest thing to do. Obviously, it's a zombie game, and zombie fiction in general, the idea of fun is not everybody's idea of fun, but there is sort of a way of doing it, right? I mean, like at the end of The Walking Dead season 1, spoiler if you haven't played it, they kill off one of the main characters, the adult male main character. And that's where I stopped with the story. So doing things like that are massive risks. I think I'm probably not the only one that didn't play season 2. And the reasons I didn't play season 2 were really personal and potentially kind of dumb, that I got really invested in the character Omid, who came in late in season 1 because he was concerned about a cat. And I didn't want to get invested until I found out what happened to Omid, and I didn't like what happened to Omid. So I'm like, I'm not playing it. And there's an instance where I deliberately spoiled myself because I didn't want to spend money on sadness. And so again, if you don't want to spend money on sadness and you're worried that that's what The Last of Us 2 is going to be, I am going to stream the game. So if you're not sure about it, especially if you're not sure about it because you read the spoilers, maybe it's a bit of a public service to play the game. You're like, okay, fine. This isn't, the downer I thought it was. I'll play it for the gameplay. Because personally, I don't think, a properly made game can be spoiled. Like, one person got mad at me for spoilers in Doom Eternal. And it's like, because of the name of a character. And it's like, how can you spoil Doom Eternal? It's a totally experiential thing. The name of a character should not spoil. I think Doom Eternal is an unspoilable game, because it's all about the gameplay. It's all about the experience of playing it. And for me, that's what The Last of Us 2 is going to come down to. Because, let's face it, the story... I mean, the first game was funny, right? There were these light moments, and they had sort of these moments of majesty in a very dreary world. If they've lost sight of that, I think the franchise is just dead in the water. It's possible they're moving over to television, and this will be a jump-off point for the television show, which would be exceptionally stupid. But those sorts of things have been done. Remember the Assassin's Creed movie? Remember how not very good that was because it's, oh no, it's a movie. We have to do things differently. I don't care. Not my circus, not my monkeys. But a couple of interesting comments came up. And some of them came up in Monday's video about what happens when they can't blame video games. But they were referring to brief comments I made on The Last of Us 2 there. I made a comment, I don't remember which video it was in, about grown men writing teenage girls proceed with caution. And somebody asked me whether I thought the same applied with adult women writing teenage boys because women don't have the experience of being teenage boys. And they referenced Harry Potter and how J.K. Rowling wrote, the inner turmoil of Harry Potter as he grew into his teenage years. And personally, I thought it was terrible. I hated that element of the later Harry Potter movies. I thought, every character in the Harry Potter books was fairly well constructed, with exceptions. But Harry Potter himself was this cardboard box of a character. Didn't like him. So, proves your point, commenter. I lost your comment. I'm sorry. I couldn't find it again. But proves your point. I didn't like it when it was in the inverse either. I think that, look at Ron Weasley in Harry Potter, right? Ron Weasley was a character based on an individual. And if you base a character on an individual, especially an individual that you could say, when you were 15 years old, what would you have done? You can get around that being unable to relate. A lot of writers, like I talked to George Perez, the comic book creator, about how he writes women. And he said, he bases them on the women in his life. And sometimes he asks them, or he's like, okay, they did that there, I'll put them in the books. That's an effective cheat because then it's authentic. There are exceptions. I want to be very, very clear. There are exceptions. Some male writers can write women very, very well. The late Terry Pratchett is an example of that, in my opinion. I'm not saying it can never be done. I'm saying be extremely careful. And like I said, come at it from a humble place. But yes, commenter, I am consistent in that regard. I couldn't stand the way teenage Harry Potter was written. Kid Harry Potter, all right, not so bad. Teenage Harry Potter drove me crazy. It's not that teenage boys aren't sullen and moody. Teenage girls are sullen and moody, but I just kept glancing off of it, and that's not true of. I thought that the way Atreus in God of War was a little jerk at times. I thought that was much more authentic. So there you go. Another person said I was full of it when I talked about supports for men. Services for men. And this made me very, very upset. Not personally, but it sort of proved my point that people aren't aware of the services that are out there. Again, I don't know what it's like in the US, but I know that in Canada, there are services specifically for men. I will show a website to you of services specifically for men because I think this is very, very, very important. If people don't know the services are there, they can't access them, and access to services is super important. So this is, come on, OBS. Okay, so this is this website here. This is the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. menandfamilies.org. This is in Canada. You see they have a center in Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, Ontario West, York Region, and then find your center. They're opening up more and more all the time. They are affected by COVID-19 services, but this is in a fairly large portion of Canada. There are, and you'll see, are you a male victim of domestic violence? These services exist. Even in areas that don't have a Canadian Centre for Men and Families, what you are looking for is a crisis bed. They don't call them men's shelters. They call them crisis beds. A little known thing is one of the reasons that women's shelters opened is because homeless shelters, were predominantly male. A lot of women won't go to them for fear of things like sexual assault. Um, Obviously a homeless shelter is not what people think of when they think of, domestic violence crisis, but that, and obviously it's definitely a last resort. But that was part of the history of why women's shelters started happening, exclusively women's shelters. But yeah, there are crisis services available for men. They are just not called men's shelters. They are called crisis beds. So that may help people. I know it's frustrating because everybody knows women's shelter, right? But men, it's that euphemism because there is stigma because of so-called benevolent sexism. So like I said, I don't know what it's like in the US. I know the US is a checkerboard. The other, I believe it's 211 service in Canada. It's run through the United Way. It is a connection for community and social services. Again, Canadian service, but 211 is a service you can call right here, and it's programs and services specific to your community. So those are some options for people, at least in Canada. Again, the U.S. tougher, right? Because you don't have a federal health act like we do up here. It makes standardization of services much, much easier, even though the services are administrated by the provinces. There is, I believe, one men's shelter in City of Toronto. It is constantly full. Most women's shelters are constantly full. That's the really awful thing about domestic abuse, especially if there are children. You kind of have to plan to make your move in advance, which is very dangerous, which is part of the reason they opened up. I mean, in Canada, worst case scenario, you can go to the emergency room and there's intervention there. But again, the US, you end up with a crazy bill for that sort of thing. And that's the real tragedy of the US. It's not just the single payer issue. Who pays for the medical bills is a connected but separate thing to how it's administrated and how consistent the services are state to state. And it's tough in the US. I'm not as familiar with local systems. This is something I feel very, very strongly about. I wish I could do something, get a grant or something like that to create sort of a pan-North American referral service so people would know where to go. But the services are out there. They do exist. It's just accessing them, knowing what to ask for, knowing where to go can be really, really difficult. But I did want people to know that the services are out there, because I know some people sincerely believe that there are not services for men in crisis, men who are being abused. That is not so. The services are there. Like I said, they can just be hard to find. The other thing that is possible is you can contact your local, something like an independent living chapter. That's the only thing I can think of in the US. They might know. The US is a tough, tough system to navigate. And this is when I get into one more thing before I get into the final thing. One person asked what to do about being accused of being argumentative. And this is a tough one. Because they're like, I've been accused of that. What do I do? And it's tough because It can be used. Here we are. Was a Taku Cat. Can we get more about being accused of being argumentative or needing to be right all the time? Because I've been accused of that so many times now by so many people that it's really gotten to me where I'm not sure how to express myself. Making me feel like expressing myself is just causing harm in one way or my opinion is less. And Zabura Man 2005 referred, before you let that get to you even further, did you bother to check whether those people were in good faith or if they were at all mentally able to understand? That good faith thing is people do use your argumentative thing to shut people down. It is something that's been notably observed that people do to women. People who transition male to female find that they are accused of that more often when they present as female. Some people will use it as a silencing tactic. They will. The truth is, you know if you can admit you're wrong. You know if you learn from criticism. You know if you are making corrections based on feedback you get. Now, there's good faith feedback and bad faith feedback. There's people who constantly criticize you to keep you down and cripple you. There's people who criticize and they mean well, but it's not terribly productive criticism. And then there's people who actually provide good feedback. Usually they'll be able to say what they like as well as what they don't like. I think there is a difference between feedback and criticism, and I think everybody should be aware that feedback has some things that make some people feel good as well as things that make people feel bad. There's no easy answer to that question. But another commenter talked about steel manning. And let's see, I can find it. Because it was I don't really like the term because to me, that's just communication. But people are aware of the whole steel manning concept. Basically, it's that before you go after someone's argument, you better be able to paraphrase it or to describe it in a way that the other person finds familiar. And this is something I've been told is called intentional dialogue. You actually say, okay, so what I understand is, you'll see me do it in interviews all the time. I'll paraphrase, I'll summarize what someone said. And if they say, yeah, that's it, or no, that's not quite it. It's very important to me because sometimes while I'm listening to somebody in an interview, and man, listening in an interview is something that you really have to practice because you're looking, okay, I got to move this to this part of the interview, but you got to make sure you're not thinking about where you're going next so much you're not listening to the person in the interview. But sometimes they'll say things and I'm like, that is potentially awkward phrasing. I better give them a chance to clarify. So I'll make a bit of a note and then say, okay, what I understand is this. And that gives them the opportunity to check. If you ask questions of someone before you jump in to tell them why they're wrong, you come off as less argumentative. That's really the only tactic I can give you that's sort of foolproof. You know, now granted, some people will say, you're interrogating me now. That can be a bad faith thing too, right? But yeah, you'll notice that the comment I took, and it's like, this is a great thing. Instead of going, yeah, you wouldn't feel the same way if it were a woman writing about a man. They actually asked, what about Harry Potter? And I'm like, yeah, I think that wasn't very good either. Yes, I said an element of Harry Potter wasn't very good. But there was an example of someone who asked a question instead of making a statement or making an accusation worse, and it was much more positive because of that. There are some really good comments in the destructive conflict video. I love videos like this where the comments are part of the experience. I am not seeing very many spoilers on the first page. I want to do one more thing. I know this is long and I haven't gotten to the main thing, but Oron Darkworld brought up Dark Lord, brought up a behavior he calls Westworlding. When a person behaves like a Westworld host who's being showed something that contradicts their programming, and he uses that to assess bad faith. Basically, a Westworld host, when something, it's like, that doesn't look like anything to me. So he says, when I see people who just continue doubling down on something, even though there's clear objective proof to the contrary, that either I know for a fact they've seen, or it's just so widely available, it's extremely implausible, they're unaware it's out there, and they just ignore it and barrel ahead or disengage from the argument, then come back a week later making the same claim and acting like the last argument never happened, that's when I deem them bad faith actors. That's actually a really, really good, that's a very high bar for assessing someone in bad faith, but I think that's really fair, because he said either they know what they're saying isn't true, or they're blatantly sticking their fingers in their ears and willfully choosing not to know. Both of these things are intellectually dishonest. And I agree, even if they're not deliberately being disingenuous, or they're not deliberately arguing in bad faith, at that point it is a waste of your time. So, getting to the thing I've been promising to talk about for days. I'm sorry, I have to do feedback on Feedback Friday, right? How not to alienate cis straight white dudes. The funny thing is, how not to do that is the same way to not alienate any other people. Don't make them seem across the board bad. Don't leverage stereotypes. Don't, make generalizations instead of treating people like individuals. And that is still something people aren't. It's tough to do in fiction, right? Because you only have so many characters. I mean, okay, in these massive open world games with all these like NPCs and stuff like that, yeah, you can do that. But like a game like The Last of Us, where there is a limited number of characters because they have to hire an actor for every single one of those characters, it sometimes you do like, wow, we want to get the diversity in there, but what if we put a person who's a minority in there and they're the villain and somebody gets offended? And so I think maybe people tend to cast the group that they are a part of as the bad guy, because then they think they're least likely to catch hell. And of course, in video games, that most often ends up being a straight, cis, white guy. And then people get upset because they feel demonized, and that reminds them of, people bring their traumas into fiction. And that's the really messy part about this. But I have real issues with treating, white people is a very different thing. And then it was actually a friend of mine who's a brown guy, like South Asian, who said he hates the term person of color. And I'm like, why? Because that's what I was taught was the sensitive thing to say. And he says, basically, it flattens the minority experience. It flattens, the Asian experience, the Latin experience, South America, Mexican, into all one thing, a Black experience into all one thing. And obviously, an Asian person is going to have a different experience than a South Asian person, a Black person, brown, like even brown. It's like, do you mean brown, like South American brown, or brown Mexican brown, or like brown South Asian? And he's right. I thought about that. It's like, yeah, that's a really kind of offensive catch-all, because Black people don't deal with the same stereotypes that Asian people do, for instance. And I guess because I'm a ginger kid, I can kind of relate to that with all the stupid assumptions people make about us. So I've tried not to use that as much. Sometimes it's hard because you're like, what does this person expect me to say? It's like, are they going to get offended if I say person of color? Or are they going to get offended if I say black person? Some people still do. I'm finding that fewer and fewer people, more and more I'm finding people actually prefer that you refer to their race. But even then gets tricky because black person, okay, because like somebody born here is like, I'm not from Africa. Brown people don't mind being called brown people, with some exceptions. I thought that was only a Canadian thing. But no, apparently brown people are fine with brown people. But you don't call an Asian person by their color. That's offensive. Yes, these things can be confusing. But yeah, but it's the same with various cultures. I mean, obviously, there are socioeconomic issues. There are regional issues. The realities of racism in Canada are much different than the issues of racism in the US, for instance, right? Like, while there is racism against all peoples in some way, shape, or form, our profound, like, historical shame in terms of systemic racism is the Indigenous population, followed by the treatment of Black people. But the stuff that was done to the Indigenous people is just really, really horrible. In that, oh no, we're doing this to help kind of way that really wasn't helpful at all. It was bigoted. And obviously that's very different than the Black experience in the US. But, I mean, there are real issues in underserved communities that, just because it's a white population and instead of a Black or brown population doesn't make poverty any less serious just because you don't have racism tacked on top of it. We actually had we used to hire street youth for day jobs, and one kind of worked her way up the ranks with us, and she was in a basement apartment and was having a terrible time out of the landlord, and we got one of those, those kind of consumer advocate types who went in there and talked to the landlord, and the place was full of black mold and all that stuff, and the guy said, like, would you let your daughter live in this apartment? And the woman responded, my daughter's not white. So anti-white racism does exist in situations like that. Like I said, I don't think, for the most part, people who develop this stuff aim to make all white people look bad. I think they are coming at it messing up the privilege check, right? They don't realize that socioeconomic privilege, educational privilege, I don't know what exactly to call it, but being able-bodied, like able-bodied privilege, all that stuff, geographic privilege, all those things are real. And when someone who is in sort of a Bay Area lifestyle goes, oh, it's no problem to make, lower socioeconomic bracket whites look like the bad guy because I'm white. It's okay. I can, use my own people as villains. Well, that's not really your own people. Your life experience doesn't match theirs. I mean, there was a bit of a kerfuffle before Far Cry 5 came out about the fact that it was basically like a white militia cult that was the bad guys in those games. I didn't have a problem with it because, I mean, the previous Far Cry games did the same thing to Black people and Asian people. But there was some kerfuffle. But then once the game came out, it seemed to die down, I think, because people who looked exactly the same and sounded exactly the same as those types were heroes, too. So it was like there were good people and bad people in that group. Problem with this is, okay, you've just taken up a lot of characters with white guys, right? And then you get criticized in another way. And I mean, I think the way around that is to treat, to treat all characters like individuals, but also to make sure that your assumptions about characters are not their default white guys, white, straight, cisgendered people until you need a reason for them not to be. There should be either no reason for anything or a reason for them to be a white dude as much as anything else. Like, I think that, and that has to do with experience, but it also just has to do with creativity, like thinking outside the box. And that's something that a lot of people who are looking to make a point don't do well, right? Because their thinking is a series of boxes. And that's why activism and art tend to not get along so well, you know? Because activism is trying to use basically Marxist theory to look, there's all these classes of people that need help because it's a numbers game in activism, right? You have to show a significant number of people are being affected by this so that some politician can justify money for funding for programs. That's the whole game. So you lump people together who really have nothing to do with each other to up your numbers to show that, no, look, these programs benefit this many people. It's all a numbers game, right? In art, it's different. In art, it's about representation. And it's not so much, oh, I'm a good person. I'm going to tell the story about a black woman instead of a white man. Well, that's not going to go over too well if that experience isn't authentic, right? And that's where we go back to my comment of, adult white men, right? Teenage girls, extremely, extremely cautiously, because just because you have teenage daughters doesn't mean you know what's going on in their heads. You probably don't, right? That's a bit of narcissism talking there. Different story if somebody is secretly gender nonconforming and nobody knows. That's why I said there are exceptions. But, again, coming at it from a humble place, is important. I think it's also important that the thing that sort of made the Far Cry games work with, the posse of evil rednecks is you got to know them. They weren't just mwahaha villains. They weren't cardboard. You found out about, the horrible experiences one had in the military. The Faith character in Far Cry 5 I actually thought was the most loathsome. But she was complex too, right? But you got to know them as people. So like I said, they were individual. They weren't just cardboard villains of, oh, evil whitey, right? Because that's no better than, the yellow peril Fu Manchu stereotype of Asian people, which Shao Kahn is in that, started off as basically a Fu Manchu yellow peril villain. However, he's clearly broadened from that. They moved away from that. But that's why I go like, why are they only focused on the women's outfits in Mortal Kombat? So much of the early stuff was reductive because it was all just, we want to make a game where we punch off people's heads and spines. Let's, put a pastiche together because we lost the Universal Soldier license, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's really the only way to do it. I know with making boss fight, Patron's got a preview of that this week. It's coming. It's just building everything is taking a really long time. One of the effects I wanted to do didn't work out. I needed to work around and it took more time. But my rule for boss fight, and maybe this will help other people, is I didn't decide a character, which it's a comedy, right? It's taking the piss out of things. It's making fun of things. I didn't determine the character was ready until I liked them in some way. Even if they were an antagonist, even if they were essentially a villain, I had to like them. I had to feel like I related to them. I had to feel like they were a human being human being to me, and maybe I just felt sorry for them, but there was a human core there instead of it just being an avatar of making a point. That's my process. I'm sure there are others, but you can tell when a game really likes its villain. Uncharted 2, that Steve Valentine character, you could tell they loved that villain. And there has not been the same spark in a villain in a Naughty Dog game since Uncharted 2. Amy Hennig, you go, girl. I'll stop there. Hopefully that helps. Some people are, well, that's really perfunctory. That dodges it. No, it really doesn't. You can't treat any group of people like a completely different thing. If you're treating any group of people like not people, that's bigotry, right? And it doesn't matter what group of people that applies to, If you're treating a human being like something distinctly different from you, not human, or another type of human in a bad way, or even a good way, in some benevolent bigotry is still bigotry. But if you're not seeing them as human to human, that is bigotry. Period. End of story. And there's no way around that. So the fact that the answer is so simple is what makes issues of bigotry, issues of racism, issues of all this stuff extremely frustrating. Now, that's a completely different kettle of fish than what people perceive or what people hear, and sensitivities to that. I can talk about that more if you guys want. Let me know. That can be a topic for next week. But hopefully that helps some. I know this is really long, but there was a lot of feedback, and there's a lot of raw nerves right now too, for various reasons. But I'll stop there because this is long. Thanks very much for watching. I forgot to do the Patreon again. If you like this sort of thing, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/InnaK. Thanks for watching.